I thought that before we got into the discussion, it might be helpful to just set the scene with a few statistics, just so that everyone knows the stakes of what our guests here are talking about. So according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, in 2022, so that's last year, 67 journalists and media workers were killed. That's the highest number since 2018 and almost a 50% increase from the year before. Many of these deaths occurred in places where there is war, such as the Ukraine, but also but others in countries where journalism is under threat constantly. And this is not the only kind of threat that journalists may face. UNESCO says that imprisonment of journalists is at an all-time high. And even the journalists who are lucky to neither be killed nor imprisoned often face harassment both in person and online. So this is why projects such as Forbidden Stories are so important. And I'm very excited to talk with our guests more about what they are doing and what readers such as yourselves can do at this crucial moment for journalism. So Laurent and Sandrine, I wanted to start out by just asking you to describe what Forbidden Stories is. How did you come to this idea, and what does your day-to-day look like?
Thank you so much, and thank you for being there. Thank you for having us. So Forbidden Stories is an organization whose mission is to continue the work of assassinated, under threat, or jail reporters. And we are doing that as a journalist. So we are doing that to make sure that we can keep the stories alive, make sure that we can, people with access to the information. Journalists are killed always for very important topics, very important stories, because they were investigating corruption, they were investigating illegal mining, they were investigating money laundering in Malta, for instance, or drug cartels in Mexico. They are killed for that. And it's not only a Mexican story, it's not only a Mexican drama when a journalist in Veracruz is killed. It's a violent attack against press freedom, of course. And the other victim in all of that is, of course, all of us, the public opinion. We are missing the information. So we need to continue the work. And if we do so, then if we are continuing the stories and if we ensure the survival of the story, not only the people we know about the story that others wanted to silence, but we will as well send a strong signal to the enemies of the killers, telling them that you kill the messenger and you will never kill the message. So this is what we are doing. And the way to do it is a collaborative way. We do that in a collaborative way because collaboration is bringing protection. So when we are starting a project, we start with the killing of someone who have been killed because he wanted to reveal something, and the killer is still free. So there is a lot of danger. So we need to team up, because it doesn't make sense to kill reporters if we are 50. So this is the principle of Forbidden Stories, and our daily life is about coordinating large and worldwide international investigation with many news organizations who are joining the effort, and our role is to coordinate those investigations and for 6, 7, 8 months, sometimes 1 year, like we did for the Pegasus Project, to make sure we can reveal the truth.
Yeah, I think Laurent answered the questions, but so I'm the editor-in-chief of Forbidden Stories, and my role is really to make those coordination work, to supervise the investigation, and to make people and usually lone wolf reporters put their ego aside and share their information and accept to work together, because collaboration is all about sharing and dividing work, and it's not in our cultural mindset as investigative journalists to share with other people. So this is, what my daily job is about, and finding compromises, trying to also make people with different cultural backgrounds, different level of even of English speaking, work together. How do you create that? How do you use the best platform, the best tools to work together to make that possible? How do you agree on a publication date? I mean, it seems very easy from the outside, but it's very complicated to find a compromise to publish on a specific date. Sometimes you have holidays in one country, sometimes you have national elections or a football match. So yeah, this is my daily job.
And so I think one thing about journalism that I've often found is the case is that people outside of our profession often have a hard time understanding what a journalist does on a day-to-day. So could you walk us through what one of these investigations might look like? Where does the idea come from? How do you find the journalists who you're going to be working with? You know, what's the initial conversation? You've worked on such huge topics, whether it's money laundering, spyware. How do you choose which ones those will be, and how do you put one foot in front of the other?
So it depends. There is no main rule or basic rule that we are following every time. But for instance, the very first investigation of Forbidden Stories was the Daphne Project. So Daphne Caruana Galizia was a Maltese journalist, and the day after the killing, we were discussing with her son Matthew. So I was calling Matthew, discussing with him. Other journalists, a friend of mine, were discussing with Matthew as well. And we were explaining to Matthew that maybe it might be a good idea to continue the work of his mother. And he was answering us, yes, that's the only thing I want now, is to make sure that someone, an organization, will continue the work of my mother, because his mother was investigating very important topics, not only for the Maltese public opinion, but for all of us in Europe and in the world. So the daily life here at Forbidden Stories is when we identify a story where we think that we can work, where we think that the collaboration makes sense, where we think that we can really add some values and find new facts and information that could be very relevant for the public opinion, then we are on board and we start a project. So, and when we start a project, our daily work here is to find the partners, to make sure that we are creating a dream team. So, for instance, on the Daphne project, we were having some people who were having excellent connection with the intelligence services. Other ones were having access to the tax database, for instance. We were working, of course, with Maltese reporters who were having a strong knowledge of the field. So we always do work with people who are local journalists, who do have large expertise on the ground, who will be there as well after the publication. So we have to all the time to take care of the risk and how much we are exposing the people. So this is also something that we consider, and we take a lot of time in your daily work here at Forbidden Stories, is to evaluate the risk and to make sure, even if journalism is always a dangerous occupation, we have to take that extremely seriously. And then there is the physical risk, there is the digital safety as well. So and I think we're going to talk as well about Pegasus, but journalists are nowadays more and more under surveillance, more and more under cyber attack. And it's difficult for journalists to protect their communication, their communication with their sources, with their editors, and that's so crucial to protect that. So when you are running large projects like that with dozens of journalists, the question of how to communicate safely, how to stay under the radar, how to not make too much noise as a big elephant moving in the place, it's a key question. But at the end, what we find in collaborative journalism that is extremely helpful and for all of us is that you have collaboration brings more protection, collaboration brings more resources, you are splitting the work, and collaboration brings more impact because you are publishing your stories worldwide with dozens of news organizations at the same time, same hour, same second. So you are creating a conversation, and the story they wanted to silence somewhere in Mexico is now on the table of many in many countries, many continents, and the goal of all of that is to not only to inform the public, but to convince the killer to think twice next time. You killer reporters see what you get at the end. Now the conversation about the corruption in Malta is everywhere. So this is how we proceed.
And on the choice, on the question of choice, I mean, as Laurent said, I mean, and this limits a little bit our choice as investigative journalists, but every investigation starts with the killing of a journalist at Forbidden Story. Every investigation we're leading. So the Daphne project started with the investigation pursuing the work of Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed in Malta in 2017. The Cartel project, which is the first project I led as an editor-in-chief, was about pursuing the work of Regina Martinez, who was a Mexican journalist who was killed in Veracruz, a very dangerous state in Mexico, and she was investigating corruption and drug trafficking. The Story Killers project, I don't know if you heard about that project about disinformation, was a story that started from the killing of Gary Lankesh, who was an Indian journalist who was writing on disinformation. So every story we're doing is starting with the killing of a journalist. And of course, the problem we have, and you mentioned it, Madeleine, when you started, is that in last year, for example, 67 journalists were killed. So in an ideal world, we would like to pursue all the work of those journalists. For the moment, we have to make some choices because we don't have a team that would let us do that. But this is, in the long run, what we would wish to do. So we choose the stories depending also on sometimes what we know from the investigation, the journalist was killed. So last year, for example, we pursued the work of a journalist called Rafael Moreno, because Rafael was in touch with us and decided to share his investigation, his work. A few weeks before he was killed, he was realizing that the threats were getting more and more serious against him. So he contacted us. He decided to secure his work through our Savebox Network. It's a tool we offer to journalists who are threatened. And so when he was killed, we decided to keep the promise we make, and we pursued his work and investigated corruption in Colombia and environmental crimes. So this is how we make the choices, because we have to make, but yeah, the idea would be to publish 67 investigation every year or less, if possible.
Yes, and it seems to me that collaborative journalism is so important given the kinds of threats that we are facing. I mean, one of the discussions that we had at the Dial as we were getting ready to launch is, and really one of the reasons that we even exist, and just for some context, we publish monthly themed issues around a given theme. September is drugs, that can only really be understood internationally. And I think when we look at what is happening in the world, you know, it's no longer really a question, at least for me, of a single bad actor or issues that are nationally focused, but rather every major issue that we look at right now, whether it's climate change, authoritarianism, these are all issues that have to be understood in an international way. And your work is obviously doing that in quite an impressive degree. So I wanted to shift a little bit to one of your most recent investigations, which you also have turned into a book, which is about Pegasus. Obviously, this concerns, I think, everyone in this room if you have a phone or know someone with a phone. So can you tell us a little bit about that investigation and where it originated and where it went?
Yeah, so Pegasus is the name of a spyware that is sold by a company called NSO Group, an Israeli company, and that's considered as a military weapon. So Pegasus is a spyware bought by state actors, dozens of countries who are using that kind of spyware to officially. It's about catching the criminals, catching the bad guys, terrorists, pedophiles, and in reality, what we were able to discover and to uncover was that the spyware were used to track dissidents, spy on journalists, spy on political opponents, spy on dissidents, and so there is a massive misuse of that kind of spyware that we were able to reveal thanks to a large collaborative effort that were involving 80 reporters called the Pegasus Project. So we revealed the Pegasus Project in July 21, and so we were teaming up with dozens of reporters investigating that, because at the very beginning Forbidden Stories and Amnesty International Security Lab, the two organizations were both granted access to a list. And on that list, that was a list of 50,000 phone numbers, just phone numbers and some timestamps associated to the phone numbers. And those phone numbers were the phone numbers of people all over the world, targeted, selected for potential surveillance by state who were using Pegasus as a spyware to target them, to potentially target them. In this list, we find many phone numbers of Emmanuel Macron, phone numbers of most of the people who were working, of the ministers who were working for the French government, other head of state, spies, many journalists, of course, many dissidents, the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed in the consulate, in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, while she was waiting for her husband, who was already dead in the consulate. They were targeting her. And so we were investigating the massive misuse of that spyware by dozens of states were using that. And so we start with that list with the phone numbers, and then the goal was to put a name on the phone number. And then when we were reaching that stage, we were calling the person, reaching out to the person to tell them that we have reasons to believe that you have been maybe you are maybe under surveillance. So we would like to do to meet you, to interview you, and to run some forensic analysis on your phone. Because we were teaming up with a team of Amnesty International Security Lab who was able to find traces of infection. So just about what the story and what the investigation was about, it was, and the book is not only the backstage of this large investigative project, but that's also a book about how cyber surveillance is a large threat against democracies, against all of us, and how not only human beings are suffering for that. When you are targeted by that kind of spyware, your life is entirely destroyed. Not only your life, but the life of the ones living around you. All your communication can be intercepted. They can activate your camera. They can activate your microphone, everything. They know everything about you, maybe much more than about yourself. So it's a nightmare for the people, but it's a nightmare and a catastrophe for democracies, because journalists are surveilled because people want to know who the source is talking to the journalist. They want to know what's going to be the next story. They want to know how to kill the story. They want to know how to destroy the reputation of the journalist. They want to know where this dissident is, what is the next country this dissident is going to be. And so they are killing, all those efforts of us, those people that we saw, the phone numbers on the list, who are trying as much as they can to build democracies or to be opponents against some dictatorship, for instance. So that was the goal of that collaborative investigation, and the goal of the book was to give voices and faces to the victims of that cyber surveillance.
And so how exactly does it work just on a technical level? I mean, how does one from afar get into someone else's phone to the point where you can access a camera or a phone book or a contact list? How does the technology actually function?
So it's extremely sophisticated, and we were very lucky to work on that specific project with the two geniuses that we're describing in our book, and who are very important for the project because they really brought that technical expertise. Their names are Claudio Garnieri and Don O'Carroll, and they're both working for Amnesty International Security Lab, and they were both they have been both focusing on Pegasus for years, since 2016, when the first victim of Pegasus was known. His name was Ahmed Mansour, and so they work on what they found in his phone with also the Citizen Lab, and so they built a whole, because the problem of, you're explaining how it does work. I can tell you that it used some kind of space and exploits to attack your phone through applications, but it's very complicated, and usually it leaves no no traces in your phone. So even if you have the spyware on your phone, you might not realize that you have been targeted. And the goal and the reason why NSO was so powerful is because they built and they sold that spyware that nobody could, and even specialists could not detect in a phone. And the reason why Claudio and Donka was so critical for that investigation is that because during years they have started investigating and analyzing phones of people who were targeted, and from the small traces of Pegasus they were able to find and detect in this first infection they were able to see, they started to build a tool analyzing and adding all traces, all what they analyzed as being a trace of Pegasus in the phone. And they compared it to phones that were not infected. And Pegasus was leaving traces that were very close and that were looking like traces you would have when a process of your iPhone, for example, would work normally. And the NSO was changing a letter or two so that the traces they would leave would look like almost a trace that you would find in your iPhone. So they built that, and this is why working with them was critical, because we had only that list of 50,000 phone numbers, but then you have to do your journalism, you have to prove that those phones had been hacked. So of course our part in that was to find the victims, to convince them to contact them safely, to make sure they would not speak about that and they would not risk their life and our security. But then once we convinced them to share their data with us, Amnesty was doing the job and was finding the traces of Pegasus. And so when we started, we didn't know what we were going to find in the phones we would have. And so the first numbers and the first phone came, and we found traces, they found traces of Pegasus. In the second phone, we found traces of Pegasus. And then when we added the analysis we had in our hand, we realized that we were very strong in our journalism, in our findings. And of course, then the project became more and more important for everybody. All the newsrooms we were working in started to involve more and more journalists in the project. And we ended up with a group of more of 80 journalists, which was a nightmare to coordinate, because I mean, you have to convince them to use specific phones they have never used before, and specific computer and work on different computers than the one they used to work on. So yeah, this was a challenge, but hopefully we managed to publish it, and it did have an impact.
So just to get, before we came out here, you were telling us about some of the challenges of that, which is coordinating an international investigation during a global pandemic without anyone being able to have access to their usual technology. So how were you communicating? How did it, and were you able to involve so many people in this investigation?
Well, it was complicated. Very challenging, of course, because we were investigating, state actors with millions to surveil us, and we were precisely investigating that activity, and plus the company that was designing, conceiving, selling that weapon. So, and we are just citizens, and we are not spy. We don't have millions to buy some entirely encrypted phones, but we have good friends, and the good friends were based this time in Germany, and they were working for the AI's Amnesty International Security Lab, and they were so excellent. They were creative, and so we cannot reveal what kind of device we were using, of course, but so we were always having in mind something, that we want to protect the source. That's always something crucial. Without sources, without people who are taking risk in their life to provide you some documents for any kind of investigation you are doing, you don't have any kind of journalism. So that's the very first goal of any kind of journalist on the planet, is to protect these sources. So every time we were discussing about anything related to the topic, we were thinking about that. Let's protect the source, the document we are working on. And so this is that was our way to address the risk and the protocol, and to design the protocol communication. And then we were that was difficult because of some restriction to travel. We were and that's a problem, because when you are teaming up with other people like that, in that kind of collaboration, you are convincing news organizations to work together, and on a daily life they are competing. So you have to find good reasons to convince them to be on board, why they should be on board with their competitor next door. So one thing that we are doing, usually we are only working with one partner per country to avoid creating local competition. But that's not always true. In Germany, we do work with the 3 German outlets over there, and so this is how we are choosing the partners, and the way to communicate is needs to be under the control of people like Claudio Garnieri and Don Carroll, who have a lot of expertise. But you still need to meet the people in person. That's all of that collaborative process is about trust. You need to trust the people, and the only way to trust the people is to meet the people. You want to know what is the behavior of that person you're going to spend the next 8 months with, and that person can endanger all the process. So you need to understand how things are working with all those people, and you need someone who will be coordinating that. You need rules as well, and if you have good rules and principle and then that's the beauty of that kind of journalism. And it's not that frequent. It's really another paradigm. Journalists are trained to become lone wolf reporters, and what we are doing is precisely the opposite thing. We don't like to work with people who have strong ego, who will say I, me every time at the beginning of every sentences. So this is that could be difficult, but at the end, the only way to address that kind of threats for democracies that is extremely global, cyber surveillance, where you have victims in many countries, where your goal is to find traces of infection on many devices, and when you want to tell what is the global pattern behind that, what that investigation is telling us about our societies, and how democracies, our elected people are failing in controlling that global misuse of the spyware. So you need a global team to do that.
Well, I have one more question for you, and then I will open it up to the audience. So I hope you start thinking now about the kinds of questions you might wish to ask. But, we've talked about so many difficult and in many ways frightening trends about the imprisonment, killing of journalists, the kind of stories that they are trying to report on. What can people who are not journalists, who are merely readers of news, do to support the work of journalists? And how can that environment change?
I think the first thing that people should do in order to protect journalism, to defend journalism, to support journalism, is to read the stories of journalists. And it sounds like a bit naive to say like that, but we are now facing a large industry of disinformation in front of us. So what is information? What is communication? What is real news? What is fake news? So what is the alternative truth? What is the truth? So we have to know what we have to know how to consume, how to deal with information. And I think this is really about education. I'm the father of 2 kids. My daughter is 11, almost 11 in 1 week. My son is 16. My son is only watching news through TikTok, and they have very good thing on TikTok, but I think we really need to talk to our young generation about how to diversify the source of information, for instance, because this is really about that. And so I think educating our kids is really crucial. I think that considering sometimes when I started becoming a journalist 25 years ago, I told my friends, well, I want to become a journalist, and or my family, and they say, oh, that's cool. You're gonna travel, you're gonna be the witness of the history. That was a cool job to have. And then when arriving at a dinner, sometimes I never mention that I'm a journalist, because I will be the one who will be asked about, okay, so you're close to the power, or you're close to the government. So for what kind of billionaire you work for? And so the perception of who the journalists are in our society and what are they really doing has changed a lot. And that's a problem, because most of the people don't trust anymore the journalists, because we are entirely confused about all those people who are coming as well on the TV and providing opinion and not facts. And so we are confused about, some news organization that are providing news with a political agenda more and more, like Fox News in the US, like CNews here in France, that are exactly the same pattern, where there is a strong political agenda to support some political interest. And so yes, and sometimes I try just to finish on this question about what people can do. Sometimes when people ask me, but what are you? How do you see your impact as a journalist, or what are you good for? And so I try to explain with the numbers of journalists being killed every year. Journalists are killed, and if they are killed, that's because they are really challenging the powerful. They are killed because they want to reveal something that is about dirty businesses from that mining company. They are killed because they want to reveal the money laundering schemes that is organized by this person that is, by the way, a member of that government. So they are killed for that. So if they are killed, that's because they are working on important stories. So that's, for me, a way to explain why journalism is important and why we need, this is what we are doing with Forbidden Stories, to keep the stories alive and to continue their work.
That was a good conclusion. Before the questions.
Yes, well, on that note, I think, it can be so difficult in our media environment where so many of us feel like we're passive recipients of news, just hearing and reading facts without knowing where they came from or how they were sourced or how someone came to this conclusion, to remember that behind every story is a journalist, or sometimes an entire international consortium of journalists. So in the spirit of fighting passivity and remaining active, now is the time for you to ask any question that you might have, whether it's about the specific work that Forbidden Stories is doing, or collaborations in general, or even what working as a journalist actually looks like. I find that many people outside our industry have a very poor sense of where the truth actually comes from. So no question too small or too big.
Can we have a round of applause, please, first? Thank you all so much for that discussion. And I echo Madeleine's encouragement to pose questions. I certainly have some if no one else has them to share. Alfonso will bring you the microphone.
Here.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk so far. I was really curious to ask about when you come into the hands of a story because a journalist has been murdered, and especially in the cases where they sort of didn't hand things over to you beforehand, how do you go about like completing the reporting for them when they're not there to tell you exactly what they're honing in on? And they're not there to sort of be the interface with sources that they've built relationships with. I was wondering what that was like.
So of course the case of Raphael is and hopefully for the moment not the major standards of the story we're working on. I mean, Rafael Moreno has shared his investigation, and we had discussions with him before he was killed, so we really had a good understanding of what he was working on. But in many cases we don't have that insight, and So it's our job as journalists, and we always start like this, trying to understand what the journalist was working on, what investigation he had published or he was planning to publish may have cost his life. And so this is this is a first pre-investigation we do at Forbidden Stories before launching a big collaboration to really understand the work, to really see if the journalist was serious as well. Of course, we have to it's because the stories were big and because we're working as a group, we have to have at least the beginning of an investigation. And in the case of Raphael, for example, it was quite impressive to see that this journalist, very isolated, with no money, no newsroom, no salary, he had a fast food that he was running to live in Colombia. He was producing quantity of good investigative work. He was sending right to responses to many and right to information to many authorities in Colombia. He had sources. He was going on the ground to document environmental crimes, and he was posting all that on Facebook. So we had a lot through Facebook. But for each investigation we launch, we really take the time to understand what the journalist was working on, to have all his work, all his articles analyzed. In the case of Gary Lankesh, we really decided to focus on a specific company, on a specific person she started to work on. And it's an article she had never published, to pursue her work into this information. So this takes, of course, a long time. And sometimes we pursue stories the journalist might not have been killed for, because sometimes we don't have we never know why he was killed for, and for the moment we don't know who killed Rafael Moreno, for example. But all his stories deserve to be followed and pursued. His stories into environmental crimes, his story into corruption. So we try to pursue as many leads as we can, and it's much easier to do that as a group, because in the case of environmental crimes, we have access to satellite images, for example, Raphael could not have access to. So he had this intuition of something happening, a mining exploring without any license, but we had the means and the tools and the expertise to go and prove that what he was starting to investigate was a good lead.
And just something to explain maybe as well, that we are we created the Savebox Network. So it's a place where journalists who are very at risk can share with us their ongoing investigation. So if something happened to them, we will continue their work. And that, I think this is really key, because most of the journalists being killed have something in common. They are very isolated. They have nobody to talk with if they are about the threats they just received. If here you're working for a newsroom in Paris or in a large places like that, you will always have a colleague where you can say, if you don't have any news from me in the next 2 days, that's about this story. I receive that threat, if something is happening to me, that's because of that guy. Those person, Cecilio Pineda, Jagendra Singh in Uttar Pradesh in India, they were alone, publishing on their own, because it was too dangerous to be a journalist. So they were publishing on their Facebook profile very dangerous stories, information about illegal mining, for instance, and they were killed for that because they were alone. And the people who are killing them, or the mastermind who are ordering the killing, think that they can get away easily with that. The impunity rate in Mexico is more than 99%. In more than 99%, you will never find the killer. You will never find the mastermind. So it tells you about how it works. So you can ask for the killing of someone for some $10 or $20, something like that. So this is why the Savebox Network is really about creating that connection that we need. The connection is bringing protection. And so we have more and more journalists and all around the world who are using the Savebox Network, and they are not only sharing with us what they are investigating and instruction, what we should do if they are disappearing, if they could kill, but they are claiming publicly the fact that for my own safety, I did protect with forbidden stories my ongoing investigation. If anything happened to me, you will see the story, not only here in Sinaloa, but in every places. So I really believe in that. This is really how I think that there is strength in the collective, that this is, I think, really the way to dissuade the people to kill the journalists, because they don't care too much about the statement. The statement, that's important to produce statement, that's important to ask governments to investigate the crimes, but there is such solid impunity bubble and shelter around them that it's how to have some impact on the killers. And I think the killers, they do care much more about having their own crimes exposed, having the name of their middlemen exposed, having the name, the identity of their offshore company exposed, and having a statement against us. So this is why what we are building with Forbidden Stories is a step-by-step thing, but all around the world, we are doing workshop to journalists who are very at risk to train them to use the Savebox Network.
Yeah, so with your mission to inform the public and to try to dissuade the bad actors from doing things again, but you're finding you're getting so much evidence about such awful criminal activities. Is there no hope of any accountability in any connection to law enforcement in cases where they might do something with the judicial system? What happens to all this information? Do they have to just start over again?
No, well, that's the question about how the impact of journalism and what the production of those revelations are. Yeah, what kind of impact we might have after that on the society. When we were publishing the Pegasus Project, many NGOs were doing a lot of advocacy work to convince MEPs in Europe, MPs in France, to create some inquiry commission to discuss about the regulation, to discuss about how to surveil and to control this industry. Same after the Story Killers project that was about the disinformation industry. There were many hearings in Brussels, for instance. Or after the publication of the Pegasus Project, the US authorities decided to blacklist the company NSO. That means that the company NSO was not anymore able to run any kind of contracts, businesses with any kind of US-based entities. So that's a sanction. So on our side, we are publishing the stories to make sure people get access to the information. And then that's the role and the mission of others, NGOs, elected people, the executive people, to then, and the citizens, to, once you're informed, to go to your mayor, your MP, to your government to ask for some changes.
What incredible work. And talking about the collaboration and the complexities of that. And you were saying about how the journalists will be trained, to sort of drill down on an investigation and keep their, information to themselves and protect it. And how you come in and you want to kind of create these collaborative structures, and that protects the journalists and so on. Do you see that kind of collaboration happening more? I mean, I'm thinking around the climate change issue. There do seem to be more collaborations happening across outlets. And I'm wondering specifically how you do this. I mean, do you go to the editor, editor-in-chief? I mean, how do you make these collaborations work? And then they assign the journalist, and do they cover the cost of that journalist? I'm just curious about the mechanics.
Yeah, I mean, there are many, many points you raised. So clearly, collaborations are a trend. I mean, it is a trend. Collaborative journalism is a trend that is rising, and we were discussing that just before being here. But so the first historical collaborative project happened and was led in 1976 after the death of a journalist called Don Bowles in Arizona. 40 colleagues, 40 journalists gathered to pursue his work and investigated actually corruption and stories he was working on. And this was really the first collaborative project in journalism that we can date. But since the Panama Papers in 2016, more and more collaborative projects are published. I don't know if you follow them, but there has been the Pandora Papers, there has been the Football Leagues. You have almost every week a collaborative project. The dimension is a bit different, but this is a trend. And I think in our case, collaboration makes sense because it brings protection, because it brings more impact. But in other cases, when you get a leak like the Panama Papers, collaboration makes sense because you're dealing with so much information, you could not do it on yourself. And the issues we're dealing with as journalists are becoming more and more global. And we're speaking of very complex financial schemes. We're speaking of international trade. We're speaking of drug trafficking. We're speaking of money laundering. Those questions, those issues are not local issues, are not national issues. They're international issues. And you would miss something if you would focus on them only from your national point of view. And of course, you don't have the means, you don't have the resources, you don't have the expertise to work on such complex stories on your own. And this is also why the rise of collaborative journalists happens with the rise of leaks. We have more and more leaks are shared in the public domain. So how to deal with that on your own, it's very complicated. So it makes sense in the world we live in to collaborate, because and Laurent was saying that even in our case, when a journalist is killed, it's never for local stories. Sometimes he starts with the local stories, but he deals with so many global issues like powerful mining companies, corrupted politicians who are laundering their money outside their countries. So this is why we need to work as a group. And then we could discuss the practical side of this for hours. The most important thing is to have a body like Forbidden Story or the ICIGs that is leading those collaborations and establishing some rules, making sure those rules are respected. So every journalist has the same, has the same importance in the group. It's important as well to work with small media, the way you would work with bigger media. It's important to make people understand they have to share, as we said, their information, their documents. So this is a lot about group dynamics, and it's part of our job to do that.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your work. Can you just indicate how you source funding for what you do? And at what point in the investigation of a story do you decide that it is a goer, that it is a story that will have legs, and therefore you need to bring in collaborators so that you don't set off on a false trail or an impossible story? So how much work do you do in-house yourself initially to establish, if you like, a prima facie case that this is worth doing? And then at what point do you approach collaborators?
So on the funding, on the revenue of Forbidden Stories, so we are a non-profit, a French one based in Paris. When I created Forbidden Stories, I wanted to have the same. I was very inspired by the model of ICIJ, that is another non-profit, who is really one of the big pioneer in collaborative journalism. They are based in DC. They are the ones who were running the Panama Papers and other projects before, and they are supported by philanthropic foundation. So we are supported by almost the same. We are supported by 16 or 17 philanthropic foundation. They are giving us some grants. Sometimes it's a 1-year grant, sometimes it's a 2 or 3 years grants, and they are supporting us as they are supporting Reporters Without Borders or CPJ or Article 19, because they want to support an organization that is working in the press freedom area or in the journalism area. So this is our model. So the fact that we have more than 16 foundations that are supporting us is a way for us to be very independent. The highest level of dependency is 17%. So that's really great in terms of visibility, stability, independence, and they are and all of them are supporting. It's a core grant, so it's a core funding. They are supporting the mission. They are not funding some investigation into some specific areas. It's a core mission. They are supporting the fact that we are continuing the work of others who have been killed. On the question about the process, we spend a lot of time in identifying the story. So this is really our daily work here at Forbidden Stories, is to see where we can make a difference, to make sure that we are continuing the stories of someone who have been killed in relation to his work. So it might take some time to make sure that that journalist has been killed because of his journalism. And then, as we say, it's a question of risk assessment as well. We don't want to endanger more people because of us. It's a question about how deep we can go in the investigation, how transnational as well this story could be as well. If we want to convince partners from the US to be on board on the project that is about a story in Guatemala, it might be interested for our American partner to find a connection with the US audience as well. So in the case of the Cartel Project, where we were continuing the work of a Mexican journalist who was killed as she was investigating a corrupted governors involved in the drug cartels, of course, it makes sense because there is national connection between the Mexican drug cartels and the US territory. So we spend some time, and once we're sure that we can do something, once we have a first idea about what could be that dream team that we are dreaming, we are knocking on the door of our best friends, the Washington Post in the US, the Guardian in the UK, in many parts of the world. In France, we do work with Le Monde, with the Radio France. We do work with investigative reporters, but not only investigative reporters. We like to work a lot with reporters who are used to be on the field, on dangerous field as well. So we try to create some hybrid teams with different skills as well, where everyone will find its own places and will be happy with the process of that collaborative work.